What could drive a mother to end the life of her own child? It's a question that seems unthinkable, yet in the case of 5-year-old Maha Hobbs, the answer is tragically real. Maha was a bright, joyful little girl, loved by everyone she met. But all of that was taken away in a manner so cold, so calculated, that it left her family and everyone who knew her in a state of disbelief. Alexis Nelson, Maha's mother, had initially planned to give her daughter up for adoption, believing it would be the best thing for Maha's future. But when that plan failed, Alexis made a far more devastating choice. She chose to end Maha's life. In the aftermath, she went to extreme lengths to erase any trace of her crime, desperately trying to cover up the truth. But before we dive deeper into this heartbreaking story, I want to take a moment to thank you, my amazing viewers and subscribers, for your incredible support. Through your likes, shares, and comments, your engagement helps make these stories more meaningful and impactful. If you're new here, welcome to Crime Chronicles, where we explore the most gripping true crime stories. Be sure to hit that subscribe button and join our growing community of true crime enthusiasts. Now let's get started, shall we? Maha was only 5, but she had a presence that seemed much bigger than her small frame. She was vibrant, joyful, and always smiling. Her laughter was infectious, and anyone who met her couldn't help but be charmed by her playful energy. Whether she was running around playing with friends or chatting with her family over video calls, Maha had a way of lighting up the room. Video calls with her grandmother, Asia, were filled with giggles and warmth, moments frozen in time that spoke to the innocence of a young girl who should have had a lifetime ahead of her. But tragedy struck far too soon. Maha's future was stolen in an instant. Her bright, full life was cut short by someone who should have protected her. Instead of the joy of growing up, Maha became a memory for those who loved her. It's hard to imagine how such a little girl with so much love to give could have met such an end, but that's the reality her family had to face. Then there was Alexis Nelson, Maha's mother. She wasn't always the cold, distant figure she became. In fact, she was once a young woman with hopes and dreams. But life had never been easy for her. Alexis had a complex history. Living far from her family, she struggled both emotionally and financially. Her isolation was only made worse by a past filled with traumatic experiences that no one should have to endure. From a young age, Alexis had learned to keep things inside, never reaching out for help, always trying to handle everything on her own. She isolated herself, avoiding the very support system that might have helped her. Her fears were irrational at times, but they were real to her. She believed that everyone else would harm her daughter, that the world outside her small bubble was too dangerous. Alexis often kept to herself, and those who knew her best described her as someone who would rather suffer alone than ask for help. The more you learned about her, the clearer it became. Alexis's overwhelming fear of being judged, of being alone, kept her from reaching out for assistance. But while Alexis's story could elicit some empathy, we can't excuse her actions. Whatever trauma she had faced, it wasn't enough to explain the unfathomable decisions she made when it came to her daughter. Terrell Hobbs, Maha's father, had always been in the background. He was distant from both Alexis and Maha, although he had once been involved in his daughter's life. Their relationship deteriorated when Alexis cut him off about 2 years prior. Terrell tried to stay in touch. He was a professional fighter, driven by his career, but his desire to be a part of Maha's life was clear. He FaceTimed with her as often as he could, but eventually Alexis stopped answering. The distance was growing and it hurt. For 2 long years, Terrell had no contact with his daughter. He hadn't seen her in person since that last visit when Maha was just a toddler. His heart ached with the lack of connection, but he couldn't seem to get through to Alexis. He wanted to be there for Maha to help raise her, but the emotional toll of being shut out by Alexis had already been done. When the tragic events unfolded, Terrell was left grappling with the guilt of not being there for Maha when she needed him the most. Now let's talk about Asia Whitley Shaw, Maha's grandmother. She lived far away from Alexis and Maha, but she still tried her best to stay involved in their lives. Asia was growing more and more concerned as she noticed Alexis's behavior becoming increasingly erratic over the months. Alexis's responses became shorter, and her promises to keep in touch grew less reliable. Asia could tell that something was off. It wasn't just the lack of communication. There was a sense that Alexis was hiding something, keeping Maha from her family. The biggest red flag was the odd comments Alexis had made about rehoming Maha, which she never fully explained. But it all started with a growing sense of unease. Asia Whitley Shaw, Maha's grandmother, couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. She had tried to stay connected with her daughter, Alexis Nelson, and her granddaughter, Maha, but lately things just didn't add up. Alexis had made some strange comments that left Asia feeling unsettled. especially when she mentioned something about rehoming Maha. At first, Asia thought it might be a misunderstanding, but when Alexis couldn't provide any clear answers, Asia's concern shifted into worry. Then, on May 30, 2023, Asia did something that no grandmother should ever have to do. She called the Aurora Police Department requesting a welfare check on her granddaughter. She couldn't ignore the nagging feeling anymore. Alexis had said something about giving Maha up for adoption, but the details didn't quite add up. She didn't know which agency was involved or even when this supposed adoption took place. But Asia couldn't just sit back and hope for the best. The police responded quickly, knowing how serious this could be. They arrived at Alexis's home, ready to follow up on the concerns. When they knocked on the door and spoke to Alexis, she told them a story that seemed a little too perfect but still raised red flags. She claimed she had given Maha up for adoption through an agency called Adoptions with Love, and to back it up, she handed the officers a phone number. Alexis was calm and confident, almost too confident, as if she knew exactly what to say to avoid suspicion. But something about her story didn't sit right with the detectives. So the officers called the agency, eager to confirm Alexis's claim. But when they did, they were met with a surprise. Adoptions with Love had no record of Alexis or Maha. The agency denied any involvement in the adoption process. It was a clear sign that Alexis's story wasn't holding up. Now the detectives were starting to suspect that Alexis wasn't being entirely honest about what had really happened to her daughter. But then things took a turn. Alexis once again changed her story. She now claimed that she had reached out to someone named Janet Dunn, who allegedly helped her find another adoption agency. This was a new name, someone who had supposedly facilitated Maha's adoption. But when pressed for more details, Alexis had nothing to show for it. She couldn't tell the detectives where to find Janet Dunn, which agency she worked for, or how to confirm any of her claims. It was as if Janet Dunn had appeared out of nowhere. Even more troubling, Alexis admitted that she had disposed of all adoption-related documents because she didn't want her family looking for Maha. This was when the detectives started to realize something wasn't right. Alexis had provided vague answers and avoided giving concrete details. She didn't have a single piece of proof to back up her story, just empty claims about adoption and a woman who seemed to exist only in her narrative. As if that wasn't enough, when they searched through Alexis's phone, there were no emails, no records of adoption inquiries, and worst of all, no pictures of Maha. It was as if Alexis had erased her entire life, not just from her phone but from reality. The detectives were now certain. Alexis was hiding something. But what? And why? Something was clearly off here, and as the investigation began to unfold, they were about to uncover secrets so deeply buried that no one, not even the closest family members, could have ever imagined the truth. As the investigation began to unfold, the detectives knew they needed to dig deeper into Alexis Nelson's life. They started with a background check, and what they found was both shocking and troubling. There were no adoption records anywhere, no sign of an agency having helped Alexis give Maha up. No paper trail, no confirmation. Alexis's story was falling apart piece by piece. But the detectives weren't done yet. So they turned to Alexis's phone. What they uncovered would change everything. Among the usual messages and calls, the detectives found Google searches. Two searches in particular caught their attention. Can you overdose from melatonin? And can you overdose from Xanax? That's when the suspicion turned to certainty. Alexis's actions were starting to speak louder than her words. It was becoming clearer. This wasn't an accidental death or a case of a mother struggling with adoption. It was something far more deliberate. Foul play seemed almost too obvious now. As the detectives pressed Alexis for more answers, it was like talking to a wall. She avoided confrontation at every turn. When they asked questions, she gave vague, evasive answers. Her story constantly shifted, never settling on any one version of events. And when the police tried to press her for real answers, Alexis grew increasingly elusive. The more they dug, the more she seemed to retreat into a shell of confusion and deception. It was as if she was trying to cover up the truth, but the cracks were starting to show. But there was another piece of the puzzle. Nick Bagel, the building maintenance worker. Nick wasn't looking for a crime. He was just doing his routine inspection of the apartments. However, on May 5, 2023, his visit to Alexis's unit would prove crucial. Nick described the situation as odd from the very start. When he entered the apartment to inspect the unit, he found that the door to Maha's bedroom was locked, but not just locked. The bedroom door was connected to the bathroom door on the opposite side by a string, preventing it from opening. A red flag right there. But it didn't stop there. As Nick listened closely, He could hear what sounded like a television playing inside Maha's room. Strange, right? It seemed harmless at first, but something was off. Nick continued to cut the string to open the door, but the door was still locked. Suddenly, out of nowhere, Alexis yelled at him through a baby monitor, telling him to leave. At this point, Nick didn't feel safe. The situation was escalating in ways he couldn't understand. He left, but his gut told him something wasn't right. The whole thing felt wrong and it made him uneasy. It was moments like these, small things that didn't make sense at the time, but looking back they became huge indicators of what was happening behind closed doors. The investigation was heating up now, and the detectives were determined to get to the truth. They secured a search warrant for Alexis's apartment and began a full search of the unit. What they found was disturbing. First, they went into Maha's room. The room was completely empty, no bed, no dresser, no toys, no clothes. Not a single sign of a child ever having lived there. The carpet was dirty with stains of an unknown origin, and there was no way to tell what had caused them. It was eerily barren, a stark contrast to the picture Alexis had painted of Maha supposedly being cared for. The rest of the apartment painted an even darker picture. No photographs of Maha, no clothes, no personal items that belonged to a child. Nothing to indicate she was ever there. This was supposed to be a home for a young girl, but it looked more like an empty shell. And then the detectives seized Alexis's phone for further investigation. When they went through it, their suspicions grew even stronger. There were no photos of Maha on her phone, not one. No pictures of the little girl who should have been the center of Alexis's world. Not even a single family photo. It was as if Maha had never existed in Alexis's life, at least not the way she was supposed to. The absence of any evidence was jarring. It was clear now, Alexis had erased every trace of Maha even from the digital world. The emotional disconnect was evident, but it wasn't just emotional neglect. It was something far more chilling. The investigation was moving at a blistering pace, and the deeper they dug, the more disturbing the revelations became. Detective Jacob Schwartz and his team knew they needed to act fast. After the mounting evidence and growing suspicions, they secured a search warrant to go back into Alexis's apartment in Aurora, Colorado. The detectives were determined to uncover the truth, no matter what it took. They began combing through every inch of the place, every drawer, every closet, every corner, until finally they came across something so unsettling it would change everything. As they stepped onto the exterior patio, a place that had once seemed so innocent, the smell hit them first. The smell was overpowering, almost unbearable. It was the unmistakable odor of decomposing flesh. Their stomachs tightened and their hearts began to race. It didn't take long for the detectives to spot something that didn't belong. A utility closet tucked away behind a pile of old boxes. When they opened the door, they found a large plastic bag tucked among other items. The smell grew stronger. Then, with a sense of dread hanging in the air, the detectives slowly began to open the bag. What they saw inside sent shockwaves through their bodies. The remains of Maha Hobbs were hidden inside, charred beyond recognition. But it wasn't just the extent of the damage that shocked them. It was the realization that Alexis had deliberately tried to destroy the evidence. Inside the bag, they found bone fragments and what appeared to be a rib cage. It was clear that Maha had been burned in an attempt to cover up the crime. Alexis had used the fireplace to incinerate her daughter's body, leaving only these haunting remnants behind. It wasn't just a tragic loss, it was a deliberate act of destruction, an attempt to erase the truth. Detective Schwartz stood frozen for a moment, the weight of the discovery settling heavily on his shoulders. He had seen a lot in his career but nothing like this. As a seasoned detective he was trained to handle tough cases, but this was different. This wasn't just a crime, it was a gut-wrenching tragedy. The detectives, normally so composed, couldn't hide the emotional toll it was taking on them. Detective Roberts turned away, his face tight with anger and disbelief. Schwartz, too, was visibly disturbed, though he tried to maintain his professionalism. The discovery hit him harder than he cared to admit. There's something about finding a child's remains in such a horrific state that changes a person. No matter how many cases you've worked, no one ever gets used to this. The detectives continued their work, but the weight of what they had uncovered lingered in the air, thick with moral anguish. How could a mother, someone who was supposed to love and protect, do this to her child? The questions kept coming, but there were no answers. They had only more evidence of the unthinkable cruelty that Alexis had committed. As soon as the remains were discovered, the crime scene team went to work. The remains were carefully collected and sent off to the coroner's office for a full autopsy. The task of confirming the identity was crucial, but the detectives already knew. The DNA testing would confirm that these charred remains belonged to Maha Hobbs. But the true horror came next. The cause of death? Due to the severe burning, the coroner couldn't determine how Maha had died just yet. It was clear that fire had played a significant role, but what caused her death? Was it asphyxiation? Was she poisoned? Or was something else at play? The mystery was far from solved, but one thing was undeniable. Maha's life had been stolen, and Alexis had gone to great lengths to destroy any trace of her daughter's existence. The detectives now had confirmation that they weren't dealing with a missing person case anymore. Maha was dead, and the full scope of her mother's actions was starting to take shape. But how far had Alexis gone to hide the truth? And would they uncover every detail of her twisted plan before it was too late? The case had become a race against time, and the stakes were higher than ever. As the investigators waited for the final autopsy report and lab results, the real work was just beginning. They had to figure out why Maha's life had been cut short, and more importantly, how Alexis's mind had gotten to the point of taking her own daughter's life. The case took a dramatic turn on May 31, 2023. Alexis Nelson, the woman who had once claimed to love and protect her daughter, was finally arrested. The detectives had spent days piecing together the shocking truth, and now it was time for Alexis to face the consequences of her actions. She was charged with child abuse resulting in death, tampering with a deceased body, and attempting to influence a public servant, all stemming from the horrific murder of her own 5-year-old daughter, Maha Hobbs. The police processed Alexis, handcuffing her and leading her away from her apartment. There was no more room for denial, no more excuses. Alexis was now facing the reality of her actions. She would remain in custody, and as the legal proceedings began to unfold, the detectives continued to build their case. They were determined to see justice done for Maha, no matter how long it took. The arrest sent shockwaves through the family, but none more than Maha's father, Terrell Hobbs. The emotions were complex. Shock, anger, and sadness all rolled into one. Terrell had been cut off from Maha's life for 2 years, and now the woman he thought he knew had done the unthinkable. He felt an overwhelming guilt for not being there when Maha needed him the most. Should he have tried harder to stay in touch? Could he have prevented this? But beyond the guilt, there was confusion. He couldn't understand why Alexis had done this. They had their issues, but to think that she would go this far, to take the life of her own daughter, was unfathomable. Terrell was left to wrestle with questions that had no clear answers. His daughter was gone, and the woman he had once trusted had taken that away. Meanwhile, Asia Whitley Shaw, Maha's grandmother, was devastated. She had always tried her best to stay involved in Maha's life despite the distance between them. But when she learned of the discovery, and that her granddaughter had been burned beyond recognition, the pain hit her like a freight train. She couldn't fathom how Alexis, her own daughter, could commit such an unspeakable act. As the arrest unfolded, Alexis's defense team tried to build a narrative of their own. They claimed that Alexis's significant childhood trauma had shaped her actions. Her past, they argued, had left her so emotionally scarred that she genuinely believed anyone else caring for Maha would cause more harm than good. They painted a picture of a woman who was overwhelmed by the pressures of motherhood and unable to cope with her own feelings of inadequacy. But despite these claims, the prosecution was not backing down. They acknowledged Alexis's troubled past, but they also pointed out that she had the opportunity to reach out for help. Alexis had a support system, family, friends, even social services. Yet instead of taking the necessary steps to ask for help, she chose violence. Her actions were not those of a mother protecting her child but of someone who had made a conscious decision to end a life. The prosecution argued that Alexis had alternatives. She could have found a safe, loving home for Maha, but she chose not to. She could have asked for help, but instead she allowed her fear, isolation, and emotions to drive her to the most irreversible decision. As the legal battle unfolded, it became clear that,